Hello. We begin today Act 3, Scene 3 of Othello, where we left off on Tuesday. This long scene presents one of the most astonishing transformations of character that we find in Shakespeare. Under Iago's step-by-step instigation, Othello changes from the loving husband and confident military commander that we've seen earlier into a raving, jealous maniac who wants to tear his new bride Desdemona into pieces. And this frightening metamorphosis takes place in only about half an hour of stage time. That's how quickly it develops. Now remember that Acts 2, 3, 4, and 5 all occur within a single day in Cyprus. And it's easy to lose sight of that because Othello's own sense of time is very different from our own. Iago achieves the transformation I described by making each step in his strategy of double knavery build on the previous steps. Each strand in his spider's web connect to an earlier one. And everything Iago says and does is intended to promote the thing that Othello fears most in life: chaos, his own word. Chaos in the world and chaos in himself. Iago accomplishes this by destabilizing Othello's certainty about anything and everything, about what he sees, about the words he hears, and about Desdemona herself, above all. Iago makes Othello distrust, then, everything and everyone except for himself, except, that is to say, for Iago. In him, he hopes Othello will invest complete and absolute faith. Well, before Act 3, Othello had believed that words can express and do express truth and reveal that truth to others, as he had spoke them so persuasively in his, quote, unvarnished tale about his love for Desdemona and hers for him that he presented, you remember, in Act 1 to the Duke, that unvarnished tale. But Iago's assault on Othello's beliefs involve him making Othello doubt that language operates the way Othello thought it did, as a transparent source of communication and truth-telling. Shortly after implanting that troubling word guilty-like in Othello's mind, Iago begins casting doubt on the stability and meaning of words in general. And he does this immediately after Othello has heard Desdemona's appeal on Cassio's behalf and said, "Sure, I can deny thee nothing, I'll talk to him." As soon as Desdemona leaves, consider this scene with Iago. Othello says, "What dost thou say, Iago? Did Michael Cassio, when you wooed my lady, know of your love?" "He did, from the first." "Well, why dost thou ask?" "But for a satisfaction of my thought, Othello, no further harm." "Why, of thy thought, Iago?" "I did not think he had been acquainted with her." "Oh, yes, and went between us very oft." "Indeed." "Indeed, and indeed. Discernest thou aught in that? Is he not honest?" "Honest, my lord?" "Honest, aye, honest." "My lord, for aught I know. What dost thou think?" "Think, my lord? Think, my lord, by heaven, thou echoest me, as if there were some monster in thy thought too hideous to be shown. Thou dost mean something. I heard thee say even now, thou likest not that when Cassio left my wife. If thou hast something shut up in thy brain, some horrible conceit, show me. If thou dost love me, show me thy thought." Okay, this is an astonishing exchange. By echoing Othello's words such as honest, Iago casts doubt on the meaning of those words and on Othello's belief that words can express truth. Even the word indeed becomes ambiguous and riddled with innuendo as Iago intones it in response to Othello's remark that Cassio indeed was very often present when he and Desdemona were courting and assisted in their relationship. But on Iago's lips, the word innuendo is full of the word indeed is full of innuendo, as is that word think. In repeating the word think, Iago hints that he is thinking, but not speaking something that would disturb Othello if he were to say it. Thus, he suggests to Othello that he is somehow concealing it in order to protect Othello from some terrible truth. Well, manipulated this way, Othello grows increasingly anxious and suspicious, fearing that what Iago is thinking is what he calls a monster too hideous to be shown. Thus, Iago's repetition of the word think forces Othello to think, while also hinting at the dangers of thinking too much about Desdemona and Cassio. But this thinking, of course, is precisely and exactly what Iago has tricked Othello now into doing. Pretending that he doesn't want him to think too much, he has gotten him to think too much about his wife and Cassio. And now that he has gotten Othello to think this way, there is no escaping from these thoughts for Othello, no escaping from these doubts. And remember that Othello finds doubt intolerable. He cannot bear this straightforward man ambiguity or uncertainty, because he sees ambiguity and uncertainty as forms of chaos, of dreaded disorder. So, Othello demands then that Iago disclose these thoughts, these suspicions, no matter how painful. Show me thy thought, he says, and then says, I prithee thee speak to me as of thy thinking, as thou dost ruminate, and give thy worst of thoughts and worst of words. Make your thoughts words and speak them. I'd rather have that than uncertainty, as if that somehow would cure him of uncertainty. Now, in his urgency to escape the uncertain, Othello reveals to Iago yet another weakness here that Iago knows he can exploit. We've already seen that Iago has identified Othello's belief in others, his jealousy, and his racial insecurity as fatal weaknesses and points of vulnerability, and attacks all of them. Now he sees and exploits a fourth tragic weakness in Othello. His inability to live in doubt is confirmed now. Iago sees this and will use the mental agony of doubt to distort Othello's experience of time and to accelerate his fall into a kind of derangement, into a kind of madness. Now, Iago's next step is to suggest that Othello's reputation as a husband and as a commander are somehow at risk, but he doesn't say this directly, of course. Here, Iago ironically echoes that emphasis on reputation that Cassio had spoken of and that Iago had scoffed at in response to Cassio. Iago knows that Othello cares deeply about how others see him, especially because he is a black Moor living in a white world. And this innuendo about how others perceive Othello only increases Othello's desperate need to know exactly what it is that Iago is thinking but not saying. Iago says, I do beseech you, though I perchance am vicious in my guess, as I confess it is my nature's plague to spy into abuses, and oft my jealousy shapes faults that are not. But it were not for your quiet nor your good, were I to tell you, nor for my manhood, honesty, and wisdom, to let you know my thoughts. What dost thou mean? Good name in man and woman is the immediate jewel of their souls. He that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him, and makes me poor indeed. By heaven, I'll know thy thoughts. Now, of course, as we noted, Iago does not define himself on the basis of his good name or how others view him. His sense of self is entirely internal and individual. But he mimics this idea that the self is defined by how others see us in order to provoke Othello, who does, to a large degree, depend upon how others see him. Not entirely, because he's defined himself also in relation to Desdemona, but certainly to some degree. Now, Iago's timing here is impeccable, because at this moment, when he has brought Othello to a pitch of intolerable confusion and anxiety, he takes the most dramatic and decisive step yet in his strategy by introducing that word jealousy. Now, he uses the word ostensibly to describe his own temperament, and he uses it also ostensibly to warn Othello against jealousy. But what he's really doing, of course, by using that word here, is implanting that dread emotion, jealousy, in Othello's brain. In short, he is giving now, by uttering the word jealousy, a name to the growing but still unnamed feeling that has been growing and inside Othello throughout the entire scene. A moment later, Iago introduces another word designed to torment the proud Othello, and that word is cuckold. The idea that Desdemona is not only making him a cuckold by betraying him, but that because a cuckold wears horns and is visible to all, that other people surely know or somehow see and are aware of the fact that he is being humiliated and betrayed. In short, that he is not just a victim of betrayal, but derision. He looks ridiculous in the eyes of other men. Thus Iago says, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on. That cuckold lives in bliss, who certain of his fate loves not his wronger. But oh, what damned minutes tells he o'er, who dotes yet doubts, suspects yet soundly loves." Note that the individual who doubts, who isn't certain, lives in damned minutes because time seems to go so unbearably slowly in that state of doubt. Better to be a cuckold and know you're a cuckold, he says, than to live in doubt. Now, the evil genius of this passage is that Iago, of course, is attacking all of Othello's points of weakness in a sense at one time. His tendency to jealousy, his racial insecurity, his inability to live in doubt, and his willingness to trust one man alone, Iago. Iago knows that a man who lives in a state of agonizing doubt is one for whom time passes so slowly that the damned minutes might seem like an hour or even a day. Now, consider this exchange just as Iago is about to leave a moment later. Iago, going, says, "My lord, I take my leave." Othello, in this brief interval, while Iago has left the stage, thinks to himself, "Why did I marry? This honest creature Iago doubtless sees and knows more, much more than he unfolds." Iago then returns, having left just long enough, as he knows, to give Othello a chance to think painfully about what is on his mind with regard to Desdemona's infidelity. Returning, he says, "My lord, I would I might entreat your honor to scan this thing no further. Leave it to time." Now note, Iago creates a pause here, creating, as I said, an opportunity for painful thought in Othello's mind, and then returns after allowing him to reflect on his situation, in which Othello is now so suspicious and so agonized that he wishes he had never married Desdemona at all. He then tells Othello, Iago does, calm down, be patient, quote, leave it to time. Knowing, of course, that to leave it to time, to be patient, is precisely what Othello cannot do. Othello finds the passage of time in his current state of mental distress slow to the point of agony. Even the moment, then, when Iago has walked away, he did it strategically, knowing that Othello would be consumed with terrible speculations. Indeed, that period in which he was gone, perhaps no more than 10 seconds of stage time, probably seemed much, much unbearably longer to Othello. Later, Othello says that Iago's disclosures have, quote, put me on the rack. Think about that a moment. A rack is a torture device that stretches out the body. Iago stretches out Othello's sense of time in a similarly painful way. He distorts Othello's sense of time so much that Othello will feel that there has been time for what he refers to as other proofs of Desdemona's infidelity, when in fact, first, there had been no proofs at all, and second, there wouldn't be time for the ones that he imagines. But Othello feels there must have been time because it seems to him as if he's endured weeks of misery rather than just a few hours. Now remember that Othello strangles Desdemona in Act 5 less than 24 hours after their arrival in Cyprus. But by then, Othello has lost all sense of time because it has become so distorted under Iago's influence. As Othello is afflicted by jealous uncertainty, the change in him is reflected in the changing style of his speech. Instead of the elegant cadences and images of sort of beautiful elements from nature that he had invoked earlier, Othello now begins to speak more like Iago, as if he has picked up this kind of language almost as a virus. He now begins to speak in the imagery of degraded beasts and sexual degradation, in the language of cynicism. Now, for example, for the first time, he says things like this: "To be once in doubt is to be resolved. Exchange me for a goat when I shall turn the business of my soul to such exflificate and blowed surmises, matching thy inference." Yes, if I accept these inferences as true, these inferences that he associates with something fly-blown, something disgusting, then I'm no better than a goat, because if I cannot believe in my wife, I cannot believe in anything. Now, for Othello, then, to be in doubt about Desdemona's love, even for a minute, he says, would be to lose belief in everything, including himself, because, as we have seen, Othello values his life in relation to her even more than he values it in relation to his reputation as a military man. Without that belief in Desdemona and in himself, he says, I would be no better than a goat. Now, Othello, however, when he says this, has not yet completely lost his faith in Desdemona. A moment later, he demands that Iago provide what he requires: visual evidence of Desdemona's infidelity. Not just verbal insinuations, but ocular proof. Thus, Othello says, "Nor from mine own weak merits will I draw the smallest fear or doubt of her revolt, for she had eyes and chose me. No, Iago, I'll see it before I doubt it. I'll see it. Give me proof. After all, she chose me." Well, Iago tells Othello that adulterous lovers, like Desdemona and Cassio, seldom exhibit their sexual transgressions openly, even though he suggests that other people know about it and that it has humiliated Othello, that it's not something that they allow others to see readily. Therefore, he suggests, Othello must try to read signs of their affair, because they're going to try to some degree to hide it. Now, these supposed signs will consist, of course, of nothing more than Iago's inventions and Othello's misreadings of what he sees from a distance or sees out of context, as, for example, the handkerchief, when it is in the hands of Bianca, Cassio's prostitute, mistress. Now, at this moment, Iago reminds Othello that Desdemona deceived her father when she married him. They eloped. Remember, this was the same warning that Brabantio issued to Othello before he left the Duke's palace in Act 1. She deceived me, she will deceive you. Othello takes this as yet another sign, or possible sign, of Desdemona's guilt. And he is so grateful to Iago for this reminder that he now says, I am bound to thee forever. This is a solemn vow that recalls Othello's marriage vow. But now Othello has fatally begun to transfer his primary allegiance in life from Desdemona, his wife, to Iago. Well, the next strand in Iago's spiderweb is to increase Othello's jealousy by playing on his heretofore submerged insecurities as a black man. In a sense, Iago has been drawing on these all along, but now it becomes more explicit. Iago does this by pointing out how strange it was that Desdemona chose Othello after turning down, quote, many proposed matches of her own clime, complexion, and degree. That is, she turned down matches that would have been, as Iago puts it, in the way all things in nature trend. It would have been perfectly reasonable and expected for her to marry a wealthy white man. Now, Iago implies that the only explanation for Desdemona's choosing him, a black man, is that she fetishized Othello's blackness, But that wasn't natural. Thus, her desire, he suggests, for Othello will end, and she'll turn to men of her own race and age and station, men like Cassio. Now, having planted this thought of race in Othello's mind, Iago then leaves the stage for Othello's tormented soliloquy of racial self-questioning. His first soliloquy. He says, "This fellow's of exceeding honesty and knows all qualities with a learned spirit of human dealings. If I do prove her haggard, though that her jesses were my heartstrings, I'd whistle her off and let her down the wind to prey at fortune. Haply," that is to say, by haply, he doesn't mean happily, he just means perhaps, "for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I am declined to the vale of years, yet that's not much. She's gone, I'm abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage, that we call these delicate creatures ours, and not their appetites. I had rather be a toad and live upon the vapor of a dungeon than keep a corner of the thing I love for others' uses. Even then this forked plague is fated to us men when we do quicken." Okay. Now, note, in this inner meditation, Othello comes very close to convincing himself that if Desdemona is guilty, then she never really loved him, and the reason she never really loved him is because he is black and older and not given to soft conversation of the kind we've seen from Cassio. He's still not sure, but he says he would rather believe in this terrible certainty that she is betraying him and never really loved him than to live any longer in this intolerable state of doubt. He says he would rather see himself and know himself to be a cuckold, growing forked horns from his head for the world to see. He would rather that than not know the truth, because he cannot bear uncertainty. Now, this urgency in Othello to know is so extreme that he will, as I've suggested, accept falsification for evidence in order to relieve the pain of doubt. Note that here again, Iago's degraded language of animalism has infected Othello's own style of speech. He now speaks of toads and compares Desdemona to a falcon bound to him by his heartstrings. Now, Iago has also affected Othello with his toxic view of women, in short, with his misogyny, because now Othello suggests that all women are dishonest and that the forked plague, that is the horns, of being a cuckold is something that men are fated to endure at birth, and that is men in general. In short, he has acquired at this moment Iago's idea that all women are natural sluts. But the most disturbing aspect of this soliloquy is the suggestion of Othello's racial self-hatred. He hates not just Desdemona, but also himself, and he associates his skin color, his blackness, with something inferior, unworthy, undesirable. In short, Othello seems to have internalized the racist attitudes of the white Venetian world in which he has lived for so many years, but not the world into which he was born. Later in the scene, Othello's hatred for his blackness seems even clearer and more militant, and certainly more troubling. He says, "By the world," in this state of doubt, "by the world, I think my wife is honest, and I think she is not. I think, Iago, that thou art just, and I think thou art not. I'll have some proof. My name, that was as fresh as Diana's visage, is now begrimed and black as my own face." Here, Othello associates what he takes to be the blackening of his reputation as a cuckold. He associates that with his own complexion. His reputation is now as begrimed as his face. Blackness here he links with shame, humiliation, and dirt. Now, if, as some argue, race in this play is a social construct, that is to say, an idea imposed on Othello by white society, race is a conception rather than anything essential or intrinsic, If that's the case, then the tragedy lies in Othello's acceptance of that idea, his absorption, his internalization of the racist ideas within the culture in which he has now been for several decades. And he internalizes those ideas now in the form of self-denigration. In this state of fear and uncertainty and a decreased sense of self-worth, at this time of Othello's acute mental agony, the mental pain has begun to become physical. He's developing a headache. And at this most inopportune of moments, a meeting occurs. He encounters Desdemona and Emilia in the street, and a crucial accident happens. Now, like the storm at sea, Iago didn't plan this one, but as with the storm, he takes advantage of it. Desdemona loses the handkerchief in the scene we're about to see that Othello had given her. Consider how this happens, because it will have fatal ramifications. Desdemona, seeing that Othello does not seem like himself, says, "What is wrong? Why do you speak so faintly? Are you not well?" "I have a pain upon my forehead. Here." "Faith, that's with watching. 'Twill away again. Let me but bind it hard within this hour. It will be well." She takes out her handkerchief. "Your napkin is too little." He pushes the handkerchief from him, and it falls unnoticed. "Let me alone." All right. Now, at this point in the play, the strawberry handkerchief that Desdemona carries with her is a symbol of Othello's love for his wife. It was, quote, his first remembrance to her. That is, it was the first gift that he gave Desdemona, a token that was meant to make her recall his love for her whenever she took it out. Okay? Desdemona cherishes this handkerchief as such. She treats it, in fact, as an extension of Othello himself, so much that Emilia says she even takes it out and talks to it. Now, as such, the handkerchief has also become then a token of her love for him, as well as his love for her. Reflecting that love, when Desdemona sees that Othello is upset and speaking so slow, she tries to bind his throbbing head with this symbol of their mutual love in order to ease his pain. He then knocks it violently away, discarding their love, if you will, in the process, in which he no longer has any faith. When Othello says, "Your napkin is too little," what he really means is, your love is too little. It's insufficient. It has been insufficient to keep you faithful to me. Thus, he regards Desdemona's gesture of trying to comfort him as insincere. Yet Desdemona is, in fact, showing her genuine love for Othello here, her compassion for his suffering that, remember, was the original wellspring of her love for him. When she heard about the pain of his youth, it was that moved her to what eventually became romantic love. Desdemona is so concerned for Othello and so concerned about his strange response that in her stunned bewilderment and concern, she momentarily forgets the handkerchief that he knocked out of her hand that lies on the street. And instead, Emilia picks it up. The very fact that she could forget this token is not a suggestion that she doesn't value it, but rather that she values Othello all the more, and that his behavior and her concern for him have obliterated any other thought from her mind, such as even picking up the napkin. Emilia picks it up instead a moment later and says to herself, "I'm glad I found this napkin. This was her first remembrance from the moor. My wayward husband hath 1,000 times wooed me to steal it, but she so loves the token, for he conjured her she should ever keep it, that she reserves it evermore about her to kiss and talk to. I'll have the work taken out and give it to Iago. What he will do with it, heavens knows, not I. Nothing but to please his fantasy." Okay. Now, knowing how much this token, this napkin, means to Desdemona, and knowing that Othello has told her always to keep it with her, why doesn't Emilia then immediately return it to Desdemona, a woman who she loves, both as a friend and almost as a kind of daughter figure? Why does she give it instead to Iago, who has done nothing in the course of this play but insult her? Well, I think in the absence of sex and under constant criticism from him for being a shrew, Emilia at this point wants to repair her marriage. This involves, unfortunately, betraying Desdemona here, though Emilia can't, of course, foresee the consequences of this action because she has no idea what Iago is plotting. But it is troubling, nonetheless, that Emilia doesn't ask herself why Iago has asked her to steal it, as she puts it, 100 times before this. Why doesn't she ask? Well, this seems like self-blinding on Emilia's part. She is so desperate to find some good in her abusive husband and to try to make him happy, to, as she puts it, in some way please his fancy, that she suppresses any suspicions about what he might want the handkerchief for and why he has been asking her to rob her best friend of it for some time. When she refers to Iago here as my wayward husband, she also almost seems to entertain the idea that somehow he might want to give it to another woman. She doesn't look very deeply, though, and that's significant, because when she shows the handkerchief to Iago a moment later, planning to give it to him, he snatches it out of her hand before she even makes the gesture, and she then does ask, "What is it to you? Why do you want it?" But she accepts, without questioning, Iago's vague remark, "I have use for it," and then leaves without another word. It seems as if Emilia doesn't want to see or know what her husband is capable of. And this is, I think, primarily rooted in her desire somehow to improve the deplorable state of her marriage by trying to make him happy. Now, the fact that Iago has asked her to steal it in the past for so long, 100 times, even if it's exaggerated, that indicates that Iago has wanted to subvert Othello, it would seem, even before the play began, possibly even before Othello and Desdemona were married. In short, it's a hint that Iago's hatred for Othello precedes his being passed over for promotion. From here on, this movement, the passage, if you will, of the handkerchief from hand to hand in the play will reflect the degradation of Othello himself, for whom the handkerchief is a kind of symbol or a metronome, if you will, something associated with him. Because from Othello, it went to Desdemona, from Desdemona to Emilia, from Emilia now to Iago, who will then plant it in Cassio's room, where Cassio will give it to the prostitute, his mistress Bianca, who will throw it back at Cassio in a fit of jealousy. What started then as a token out of Othello's hand of love and faith given to Desdemona winds up in the hands of a prostitute. Why is Othello's head throbbing here? Well, in this state of rage and confusion and despair, he finds that he is ready to explode. And he blames Iago for stirring up these terrible emotions that have robbed him of his belief in himself. And he again demands absolute proof that Desdemona is in fact cheating on him, because it is giving him physical as well as mental anguish now. Othello says, "Be sure of it. Give me the ocular proof, Iago, or by the worth of mine eternal soul, thou hadst better been born a dog than answer my wake wrath." You better be telling me the truth. You better offer evidence of what you're claiming, or better you were born a dog. I will destroy you. Now, in response to this threat, Iago immediately plays the innocent victim of the ever-faithful truth-teller who is now being threatened by the man he's trying to help. But Iago then goes on to provide two pieces of what seem to be proof, if you will, for the ever-desperate Othello, who cannot bear not having proof. The first would-be piece of evidence comes again when he positions Othello at a distance to see another conversation between Desdemona and Cassio, one that Othello cannot hear. The second comes when he plants the handkerchief in Cassio's bedchamber so that Desdemona can't produce it when Othello demands that she do so. These two pieces of what Othello will take to be ocular proof are not, of course, ocular proof, but they're close enough to convince him. But before we get either of these would-be pieces of visual evidence, Iago does something else to create a sense that Desdemona has betrayed him in Othello's mind. And that is this. He fabricates a story that is so vivid in its details, though it's just a story, that Othello sees it in his mind, can't forget it, and takes it as if it were an actual piece of evidence rather than simply a story. It is one of the most fascinating and revealing moments in the play when Iago describes this, and you saw it in the clip from Orson Welles' film version that I sent you. That film version from the early 1950s was shot on a shoestring after Welles was booted out of Hollywood on the coast of Morocco, where you'll recall the crashing waves as they're standing up above the sea are a perfect expression of the violent rage building in Othello, who later compares that violent rage in himself, in fact, to a sea current. Here is what Iago says. He says that, "I lay one night with Cassio lately, and being troubled with a raging tooth, I could not sleep. There are a kind of men so loose of soul that in their sleeps will mutter their affairs. One of this kind is Cassio. In sleep I heard him say, 'Sweet Desdemona, let us be wary, let us hide our loves.' And then, sir, would he gripe and wring my hand, cry, 'Oh, sweet creature,' and then kiss me hard, as if he plucked up kisses by the roots that grew upon my lips, lay his leg over my thigh, and sigh and kissed, and then cried, 'Cursed fate that gave thee, Desdemona, to the Moor.' Othello, 'Monstrous, monstrous!' And this may help to thicken other proofs, Iago says, other proofs that do demonstrate it thinly. Othello then says, 'I'll tear her all to pieces.'" Whoa, okay. Now, note, this isn't just Iago's attempt to heighten Othello's jealousy. It is certainly that, but it is something else. It is Iago's own homoerotic fantasy. While the details are meant to imprint themselves in Othello's mind so that he can never forget them, and they do, those details that are so vivid also make us realize that Iago has cherished this fantasy secretly for some time. He tells Othello a moment later, "I see you are eaten up with passion," but we could say the same thing is true of Iago. He is eaten up with a peculiar kind of passion for Cassio. He desires Cassio, but he also hates Cassio all the more because Cassio is the object of his desire. He hates the fact that he desires him at all, not to mention the fact that he hates everything that Cassio represents and the fact that Cassio has gotten the promotion. But the very fact of his desire that he indulges here in this fantasy is rooted in this attraction and hatred for Cassio. Now, note here that we know now why Iago, who dreams, who describes this, we know now why he cannot satisfy his wife sexually. In this fantasy, he puts himself into the position of Desdemona, who he says Cassio, in his dream, believes he is embracing and kissing passionately. Well, Iago, in this fantasy, in that position, clearly takes erotic pleasure in that, though he also, as I've suggested, despises Cassio for arousing that pleasure. But it's clear that if what we're dealing with here, then, in Iago, is a closeted gay man, why he is impotent with Emilia, and why he has not produced any children. It also explains, in a certain sense, why Iago hates the heterosexual world. It's because he can never be a part of it. He can never engender life. Instead, he can only hate the heterosexual world and engender evil. nor is he able to act openly on his homosexual desires. Thus, he hates those desires as well, even as he gratifies them in this fantasy. Well, consider Othello's immediate response, which I read at the end. I'll tear her all to pieces. I'll tear her all to pieces. And he accedes to the idea that this description in some way corroborates other proofs. Other proofs? Well, of course, there have been no other proofs. But the images here are so overpowering that Othello takes the story as proof and accedes to the idea that there have been others. The very thing that he has demanded, in short, from Iago, ocular proof, he now somehow assumes, in fact, has already been provided when it hasn't been provided at all. Also note, instead of asking Iago why he was sleeping in Cassio's bedroom, something Iago never explains, or what any of it had to do with Iago's toothache, he simply erupts in a fantasy of violence. I'll tear her all to pieces. His ability to question Iago, to think clearly or rationally, is clearly breaking down. Now, as if he had actually witnessed what Iago described in Cassio's bedchamber, Othello says, quote, "Now I do see it is true." Well, he sees it only in his mind. Okay, now, at this point, it is Othello who pledges himself to the devil, casting off his acquired Christianity that he had valued at the start of the play, along with the civilized manners he had acquired. It's as if now he bids farewell to both of them. "Now I do see 'tis true. Look here, Iago. Arise, black vengeance, from hollow hell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate." Wow. "Blood, blood, blood!" Othello cries a moment later. "I want blood, blood, blood." Wow. Now, you'll note that he also describes these feelings in him as a kind of force or energy beyond all control. Iago, like to the Pontic sea, whose icy current and compulsive course ne'er feels retiring ebb, but keeps due on to the Proponic and the Hellespont, even so my bloody thoughts and violent place shall ne'er look back. Blood, blood, blood. Wow. Now, the image of the sea here, of the Pontic Sea, which he uses to describe his drive toward vengeance, is an image, this sea image, that runs through the entire play, from the storm at sea as a literal manifestation onward. And indeed, that storm at sea reflects the storm in Othello at this moment. Othello compares his rage for vengeance to a sea current that can't be deterred. His bloody thoughts are beyond all governance. Where you recall earlier in the day, he had felt vengeance rising and had tried to subdue it after seeing the altercation between Montano and Cassio. But here's the problem. If Othello can't control himself, and he now acknowledges he cannot, how can he then control or command other men? Well, he realizes he can't. Having lost his belief or certainty in Desdemona, Othello now loses belief in himself as a civilized man and also as a military general. Realizing this, he bitterly bids farewell to everything that he once was. Thus, he says, "Oh, now forever farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troops and the big wars that make ambition's virtue. Oh, farewell, farewell the neighing steed and the shrill trump. Farewell, farewell, Othello's occupations gone." Within half an hour, in this scene, Iago has robbed Othello of his identity as a husband and as a military commander. When Desdemona sees Othello in this condition, a little later, she rightly observes, quote, "My lord is not my lord." That is, he's a different man than the one she married. Now, Iago tells Othello, quote, "You are eaten up with passion." And in saying that, and I mentioned it earlier, Iago is drawing on another of the play's image patterns, eating. Othello is eaten up with jealousy and rage, while Iago, as a predator, consumes rather than being eaten. He's the spider who figuratively catches and devours his victims. Now, having been exploited by Iago, who treats her so cruelly, Emilia suspects that all men are somehow like that, in that they use women, that they basically devour them for their own good. She tells Desdemona, "Men are all but stomachs, and we all are but their food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us." Well, Iago, treats Emilia with disdain and uses her, belches her, if you will. But note that in saying this, the remark comes from a woman who is at times discerning and at other times self-blinded. And remember that even though she complains that Iago has eaten and used and belched her, she has also willfully blinded herself to Iago's capacity for malignant behavior. When she gave him the handkerchief that Desdemona had dropped, she gave it to him to please him, to try in some way to improve her marriage. In fact, this complex woman, Emilia, even lies when Desdemona asks her how it was that she could have dropped her handkerchief and lost it. She can't remember. Emilia knows but doesn't tell her. Now, Emilia then is a fascinating mixture of truth and falsity, honesty and self-deception, devotion and betrayal. She tries to open Desdemona's eyes when she explains that Othello is behaving strangely because he is jealous. And Emilia says quite accurately that jealous men are always irrational. Indeed, Emilia might well have noticed in Iago the kind of jealousy that we saw at the beginning of the play. So that she says to Desdemona, whom she's trying to help here, to make aware, she says, "But jealous souls will not be answered so. They are not ever jealous for the cause, but jealous for they are jealous. It is a monster begot upon itself, born of itself. It is the green-eyed monster. Jealousy reproduces itself, builds itself, preys on itself, so that it grows constantly. It doesn't require much to feed it. Thus, it's not going to require much ocular evidence to feed Othello's jealousy, because the nature of jealousy is to propel itself and expand itself by its very nature." Now, note that Emilia makes this assessment about the self-perpetuating nature of jealousy after a shocking scene in which Othello insults Desdemona by telling her that when he sees her again in the street, quote, "Your hand is hot and moist," a sign of lecherousness. Othello calls her, quote, "a young and sweating devil," suggesting that she is, like most women, oversexed. And then when he asks to see the strawberry handkerchief, she, of course, Desdemona, cannot produce it. And this absence confirms Othello's suspicion. It seems to him like an ocular proof of her adultery, not by the presence of something, but in this case by its non-presence, by its absence. And the fact that she doesn't have the handkerchief that he had asked her always to keep on her, but without explaining, prompts Othello to relate the strange history of the handkerchief he gave her that he has never told her before, sort of the prehistory of it. Here it is. "That handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. She told her, while she kept it, 'twould make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. But if she lost it, or made a gift of it, my father's eye should hold her loathed, and his spirit should hunt after new fancies. She, my mother dying, gave it me and bid me, when my fate would have me wive, to give it her. I did so, and take heed on it. Make it, darling, like your precious. Aye, to lose it or give it away were perdition. Nothing could match. And then, a moment later, he continues. 'Tis true, there's magic in the web of it. A Sibyl that had numbered in the world the sun to course 200 compasses, in her prophetic fury sewed the work. The worms were hallowed that did breed the silk, and it was dyed in mummy, which the skillful conserved of the maidens' hearts. Okay. Now, although we know that Othello was Christianized and civilized, if you will, in Venice, his origins in the so-called pagan world are like those of the handkerchief itself, steeped in superstition, magic, and the irrational, the very things that Brabantio railed against in him at the start of the play. Othello refers to the handkerchief as a web, okay? It is woven, thus it's a web, which of course recalls the web that Iago refers to repeatedly, that he is spinning and indeed using the handkerchief, in this case the handkerchief's absence, in his own web to destroy Othello's sanity. Now, Othello explains that the napkin originated with a 200-year-old fortune teller, a Sibyl, who had magic silkworms weave the fabric and then soaked that fabric in a potion distilled from the embalmed hearts of mummified virgins. Now, if we are to believe this account, from the start then, the handkerchief is linked with the death of innocent females, those mummified virgins, and that certainly looks ahead to Desdemona's own death. The Sibyl, Othello says, gave the napkin then to an Egyptian charmer, a fortune teller, who in turn then gave it to Othello's mother with a magic spell attached to it. To wit, she could keep her husband, Othello's father, faithful as long as he didn't lose it. Okay? Now, bear that in mind, because of course Othello has told Desdemona she must never lose it as well, but didn't explain the superstitious history behind it. By extension then, when Othello gave the family heirloom to Desdemona, it wasn't just a token of his love, but also clearly a kind of test, though not one, it seems, that Desdemona understood in the context of the magic in this web. Now, you remember that early in the play, Othello pledged his very life on Desdemona's love for him. But now he suggests that he can no longer retain belief in that love because she has lost the very emblem of that love, so it seems, in not being able to produce the handkerchief. And he suspects, of course, that she has given it to Cassio. It's missing. And what else is missing is his faith in her. His faith in her and her love for her now are nearly gone. Now, as Othello will soon see, the handkerchief at this moment is in the hands of a prostitute, Bianca, who is hopelessly in love with Cassio. Othello later sees the passage of that handkerchief then into Bianca's hands, this thing that he had given to Desdemona, and regards it of evidence, of course, of the corruption of Desdemona's love for him. How could she give this to another man who has now in turn given it to a prostitute? But what the passage of that handkerchief from Othello finally winding up in the hands of Bianca really reveals, of course, is the degradation of Othello's love for Desdemona, and in some ways the degradation of his character under the corrupting influence of Iago. Well, you remember that Cassio had given the handkerchief to Bianca after finding it in his room where Iago had planted it. Not knowing that it was Desdemona's, Cassio then told the courtesan to make a copy of it because he liked the pattern. Bianca assumes that this is that he's asking her to do this because he wants to give the handkerchief to another woman, and jealous as she is, she resentfully flings it back at Cassio. But her jealous unhappiness is interesting here because Bianca understands the subjective nature of time in a way that Othello doesn't, even though he is distorting time. Bianca says, speaking of her own jealousy, Lovers' absent hours are more tedious than the dial 80 times. In short, when you're separated from someone you love and jealous, time seems to pass 8 times more slowly. She grasps this distortion of time subjectively. Othello does not. Now, from a racial point of view, Othello's account of the history of the handkerchief is, I think, the most troubling event in the entire play, because it is here that Othello seems to be living down to the stereotypes about black non-Christians that have circulated in Venice from the start. The idea that they practice black magic, that they live by strange, unsavory superstitions that contaminate them with evil and death. All of that seems bound up with his description of the origins of this handkerchief. Here's the problem. Up until now, we have regarded those sorts of assumptions as cultural constructions, distorted, racist attitudes that the white world has created, constructed race in that regard. And we've assumed that there is nothing actually intrinsic in Othello's blackness that is associated with it. But while we had earlier assumed that Othello had simply assimilated those racist ideas as a form of racial self-hatred, this declaration has to make us question that assumption. Because this passage seems to be one in which Othello indicates that his origin as a black pagan really was steeped in these strange, barbaric practices, that these racial traits, in short, are essential and intrinsic as a part of him that seems to run much deeper than the Christian coding he has acquired, much as the history of the handkerchief in its origins runs much deeper and is sort of in some ways more powerful than the meanings attached to it when he gave it to Desdemona as a kind of token of love. And what is most disturbing of all here, I think, from the question of racism, is that Othello now embraces this primitive part of himself as authentic, just as he has embraced the devil in defiance of Desdemona and the white Christian world. This passage, not surprisingly then, has lent support to those who claim that Othello is a racist play, because it seems to validate racist attitudes toward Moors and blacks that prove to be, in fact, true and authentic, at least from the perspective of the Black Moor himself at this moment. But is this account true? Well, some have argued that it is not. Some have questioned it because Othello later refers to this history of the handkerchief, as we'll see, in Act 5. And there he says that his father gave it to his mother in order to ensure her fidelity, thereby reversing what he says here when he claims his mother gave it to his father. Now, there are ways in which we can try to explain this glaring inconsistency. But the inconsistency itself has led some to suggest that he's telling this story not because it's true, but because in his rage against Desdemona, he wants to frighten her with it in some way. Personally, I am inclined to think that the story he is telling about its history is authentic, fantastic though it may seem, and that there are ways in which we can explain the inconsistency later, and therefore that the problem of a sense of intrinsic racial depravity that Othello expresses here hangs over the play, and indeed, I think, poses significant moral questions for readers, especially today. But before we get to that point where he contradicts himself about the handkerchief in Act 5, we need, of course, to address Act 4, which we turn to now. As Act 4 opens, Othello is tortured by two recent things that prey upon his memory, things that he cannot forget. The first is his knowledge that Desdemona could not produce the handkerchief when he had demanded she show it to him. This is something that he would like very much to forget, but Iago won't let him. But for the handkerchief, Iago says, to which Othello replies, By heaven, I would most gladly have forgot it. Thou sayest it. Oh, it comes o'er my memory as doth the raven or the infectious house boding to all. Yes, every time he thinks about that missing handkerchief, it torments him. He would like to forget it, but he can't. And the second thing he can't forget, of course, are those images of adultery conjured up by Iago in his story about sleeping in Cassio's bedchamber. He can't dislodge from his mind those images of Iago imagining that he was plucking up kisses from the roots of Desdemona's mouth. The effect of these memories is so overwhelming that Othello collapses a moment later in a seizure as madness now begins to overtake him. He begins to babble, lie with her, lie on her, we say on her when she's beliar, lie with the zounds, is not words that shakes me thus, pish, noises, ears and lips, again, the images that were planted in his mind, is it possible, confess, handkerchief, oh devil, he falls into a trance. Iago says, work on, my medicine works, this credulous fools are caught. When Cassio comes in and asks, why is the commander writhing on the ground, Iago says he has fallen into an epilepsy. This is his second fit. He had one yesterday. He foams at the mouth, and by he breaks out in savage madness, but it's okay. It's a temporary thing. Now, note then that in saying this, in contriving this story about Othello and epilepsy, Iago is once again lying. And when Othello revives, Iago tells him that he made up excuses for his ecstasy, and that part is true. He did make up excuses, but he doesn't tell Othello why. In truth, Iago lied to Cassio here because he doesn't want Cassio to suspect that the real cause of this savage madness is jealousy. No, Iago knows that Cassio and Desdemona must be kept in the dark about Othello's jealousy and the extent of it. He knows that Othello's madness is entirely his own contrivance, what Iago in this passage calls his medicine, ironically. His medicine, of course, is poison, the poisoning of Othello's mind that has produced this breakdown. Now, earlier, Iago had told Othello that it would have been better, if you didn't know you were a cuckold. The cuckold whose wife cheats on him but doesn't know it can still enjoy some happiness. But now he insists that Othello see the extent of his cuckoldry fully. And in order to provide more of the ocular evidence that Othello still craves, Iago again positions Othello just where he wants him in order to distort Othello's sense of space. He positions him at a spatial distance as Desdemona and Cassio, spatial distance, where he can't see, where he can only read gestures but can't hear spoken words. And he tells Othello instead to mark Cassio's gestures, as he sees him talking to Bianca, in this case, not to Desdemona. In short, interpret from what the gestures and facial expressions reveal the truth of what I've been telling you about Desdemona's infidelity. At one point, in fact, as he manipulates Othello, Iago even calls Othello closer so that he can see the gestures even more clearly and draw his own conclusions. He stage manages the scene, in short, the scene in which he speaks with Cassio after Cassio has spoken with Bianca, knowing that Iago is misinterpreting the context when he sees Cassio's body roiling with laughter as Iago speaks to him. Iago is teasing Cassio about Bianca, but Othello thinks Cassio is laughing in mockery at Desdemona having seduced and then abandoned her. From Othello's perspective, this is horrific beyond words. Looking at Cassio laughing as Iago chats with him, he says, "Look how he laughs already." Iago then says to Cassio, "She gives it out that you shall marry her. Do you intend it?" Ha 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 ha. Iago is talking about, of course, the rumor that Cassio will marry Bianca. And, of course, she's a prostitute. Cassio laughs at it Othello, looking from a distance, thinks, of course, he's laughing at the idea that Desdemona wants him to marry her. You triumph, Roman. Do you triumph, he says. Yes. He's appalled at this. A moment later, he says, Iago beckons me now. He begins the story. Cassio says, she was here even now. She haunts me every place. He's talking about Bianca. But Othello, looking at this, thinks, crying, oh dear Cassio, as it were. His gesture imports it. And now he tells her how she plucked him by the chamber. Okay, now Bianca enters again a moment later, but consider this. Othello is so convinced by this misreading of Cassio's laughter and his gestures that he actually supplies words himself for what Cassio is saying, even though he can't hear those words. Thus he says, crying, oh dear Cassio, as it were. His gesture imports it. From the gesture, he supplies the words, the terrible corrosive words that he imagines have to do not with Bianca, but with Cassio's seduction and now abandonment of Desdemona. When Bianca enters and reveals the handkerchief, and of course Othello is there to see it, now, looking at that, Othello is satisfied that this is the final ocular proof that he has been seeking. Now, ironically, of course, he doesn't understand the context. Bianca is returning the item, the handkerchief, to Cassio disdainfully because she knows that Cassio got it from another woman. Bianca's jealousy as a prostitute, one might say, is a comic echo of the tragic, destructive jealousy that Othello experiences as he watches this token of his love and faith being bandied about now in the hand of a courtesan who throws it back at Cassio. And Othello's violent response immediately afterward is inevitable because Iago now seems to have provided what Aristotle refers to as tragic necessity. This is enough to make the tragedy of Othello's murder and suicide entirely plausible. Othello, seeing Bianca with the handkerchief, says, by heaven, that should be my handkerchief. And when Iago returns to him, having positioned him so that he can see this and misinterpret it, Othello, coming forward, says, how shall I murder him, Iago? Did you perceive how he laughed at his vice? Oh, Iago! And did you see the handkerchief? That was mine! Yours by this hand, and to see how he prizes the foolish woman, your wife. She gave it him, and he hath given it to a whore. Othello, I would have 9 years of killing him, a fine woman, a fair woman, a sweet woman. Othello is appalled, of course, at the idea that that Cassio would cast off his wife for a prostitute. Now you must forget that, Iago says, knowing that he's never going to be able to forget what he's just seen. To which Iago says, let her rot and perish and be damned tonight, for she shall not live. No, my heart is turned to stone. Now, note that even as Othello threatens to kill Cassio, he thinks with pity for a moment here about Desdemona. He says, a fine woman, a fair woman, a sweet woman. It's clear that there's a part of him that still loves her. And we're reminded then, as he then moves on to a description of how he will of necessity kill her tonight. She must rot and perish and be damned tonight. She cannot live. As he moves suddenly to that state of extraordinary hatred, we're again reminded of remark Iago made earlier, that there's a co-functional relationship between the depth of one's love and the depth of one's hatred here. Note that the same man then who can recall Desdemona as fine and sweet and gentle and admirable, what he says, a woman of plenteous wit and invention, swinging back and forth, then a moment later describes how, given the depth of his rage, he must destroy her. Get me some poison, Iago, this night. I'll not expostulate with her, lest her body and beauty unprovide my mind again. This night, Iago. Do it not with poison, Othello. Strangle her in her bed. Even the bed she hath contaminated. To which Othello says, Good, good. The justice of that pleases. Very good. Now, poisoning Desdemona would be symbolically apt, because after all, Othello's jealous hatred of her has been the product of Iago's poisoning of his mind. But Iago says, no, don't poison her, rather strangle her in her bed. It's more brutal. Having extended Othello's suffering by distorting his sense of time and putting him on the rack, Iago now urges Othello to inflict the most brutal kind of death on Desdemona that will require a period of just agonizing suffering, as we shall see. When he doesn't strangle her, but in that bed, Iago mentions, smothers her. But Iago would like it to be as painful and as long a death as possible. In short, we see again that Iago is a consummate sadist. Even though Othello had pledged himself, shortly before this, to the devil, it's notable that he now has begun to conceive of it not so much as an act of evil, but more and more as an act of justice. He's beginning to justify it already in his own mind as a form of righteous vengeance. And as we'll see in Act 5, when he approaches Desdemona to execute her in this place of her supposed adultery, he sees it as just that he is doing it there, but also that he is in some way enacting a just cause. In fact, he'll repeat that word again and again, the cause, the cause, the cause, trying to convince himself that this isn't a murder driven by rage and hatred alone, but that it's an act of justice. Now, when Desdemona appears, as she always seems to appear at the worst possible moments, a moment later, she is with Ludvicchio. He is an emissary from Venice, and he is bringing a message that calls Othello back to Venice because his military services are now required in Mauritania. That's notable because that is a place in North Africa, possibly the kind of place where Othello is from, though we're not sure. The note informs him, the message, that Cassio will be taking Othello's place as the leader of the troops in Cyprus. Well, as you can imagine, this news only stokes Othello's fury because now the white man whom he demoted, Cassio, and whom he thinks has replaced him in his bed and has then cast off his own wife, that man, he now discovers, whom he had demoted, is replacing him as commander. Desdemona has seen how unhappy Othello is over the past hour or so. And so she innocently tells her husband that she is glad that he'll be leaving Cyprus. This is something, of course, he completely misinterprets. He immediately assumes that she is insinuating that she will be glad because then she can carry on affairs. And he calls her devil. And then, to the astonishment of all, he strikes her right there in the street, as you saw in the scene in which Lawrence Fishburne strikes Irene Jacob in the 1995 film version of Othello that I sent you. Well, how do we interpret Desdemona's statements that I'm glad on it? That is to say, I'm glad that you are going to be leaving Cyprus. What she means is that she is glad that he will be leaving this place because she assumes that Cyprus has had some deleterious effect upon his mood and upon his entire bearing. But he interprets it, of course, as suggesting that she is glad that he will be leaving because Cassio will now be promoted. And after all, she has been working to get Cassio's commission back again. And Othello imagines that she is also glad of it because she still lusts after Cassio. Now, note that in this entire scene, Desdemona remains clueless and victimized and completely innocent. But Othello remembers her earlier performance with him when she had come to him and insisted that he take Cassio back, and now he calls attention to this after the scene. She can turn and turn and turn, he says, and yet go on and turn again. Proceed you in your tears, O well-painted passion. I'm commanded home. After he strikes her and he sees Desdemona weeping, he assumes they are crocodile tears, that it's all a performance. Goats and monkeys, he says. The only thing that he can believe is that when she came to plead on Cassio's behalf, she was really pleading on her own behalf so that Cassio could stay there, and because it is Cassio that she loves. In short, he regards her as a woman of absolute deceit, and also, of course, still remembers that she deceived her father in order to marry him. Now, when he strikes her, and when he goes off speaking goats and monkeys, he is approaching full-blown madness. He has come to see the world as a predatory place driven by nothing but lust and filled with deceits. For Othello at this moment, human beings are no better than the most libidinal of animals, goats and monkeys, and at the same time, he doesn't seem to regard himself as in any way civilized, because he seems to have re-embraced a kind of primitive past that is filled with brutality and superstition. Othello is now so convinced of Desdemona's guilt that when he interrogates Emilia immediately after this, and Emilia assures him that Desdemona is, quote, honest, chaste, and true, despite this statement, Othello is now absolutely incapable of regaining belief in her. He dismisses Emilia's defense of Desdemona as dishonest and calls Emilia a lying bawd, that is, a pimp. In fact, he suspects at this point that Emilia helped to arrange Desdemona's affair with Michael Cassio. Well, what will follow is still a yet more terrible scene between Othello and Desdemona at the end of Act 4. And we'll take up that scene when we meet again on Tuesday, and we'll then move to the end of the play all the way through Act 5. I'll see you then.